A tide of change is sweeping the country.
Donald Trump says his presidency is the beginning of a golden age for America. And his inauguration speech laid out a populist agenda spanning borders, classrooms, and even space. How is the world viewing Trump's first address in his second term in office? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. A sweeping indictment of the policies of the last 4 years and grand promises to fix America's problems. That formed the heart of Donald Trump's 30-minute inauguration address, in which he aimed to project himself as the savior of the country. The new U.S. president declared a national emergency along the border with Mexico and said he'll send troops to stop what he called the invasion of America. And he promised tariffs on imports, saying it would enrich our citizens. But he didn't action any when signing more than 200 executive orders. Trump also promised to take control of the Panama Canal, but didn't specify how. All this on day one of his second term at the White House. So what do his words and actions mean for other nations? Do they have substance? And will they make a difference to the US and the rest of the world? We'll address those questions to our guests in a moment, but first this report by Katia Lopez-Horayan.
Promising a golden age for the U.S., President Donald Trump began his second term pledging to rescue the country from what he describes as years of betrayal and decline. Cracking down on immigration, he signed executive orders, including ending the right of U.S. citizenship through birth and declaring an emergency along the southern border.
Revoked nearly 80 destructive and radical executive actions of the previous administration, one of the worst administrations in history, maybe not one of them, the worst. Anybody that would allow millions of people to pour through our borders from jails, prisons, mental institutions, insane asylums.
In his inauguration speech, Trump also unveiled sweeping proposals to shake up U.S. energy production.
Drill, baby, drill.
Including the extraction of fossil fuels and turning back environmental protections.
You know, we're excited about Trump, but we're also just excited about the new policies that he's bringing in.
Responding to Trump's America First messaging, protests were held in some cities, with demonstrators saying Trump's strongman approach is dangerous and driven by ego. Abroad, protesters also rallied in Brussels, fearing Trump's disruptive style will turn longtime allies into adversaries.
I'm concerned about a lot of things, climate, but also human rights. I'm very afraid of big tech becoming very big in the US, but also in Europe.
China is operating the Panama Canal.
Trump also threatened to take back control of the Panama Canal.
And we're taking it back.
Some analysts say it displays his extreme political vision.
What is in Panama belongs to us. The canal is Panamanian. Panamanian sovereignty, self-determination is Panamanian. The US has nothing here.
As Trump begins his second term, now both supporters and critics seem to be preparing for 4 years of the unexpected. Katia Lopez-Horayan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C. is Nadia Brown, a professor of government at Georgetown University, specializing in identity politics and legislative studies. In Brussels is James Moran, an economist and former EU ambassador. And also in Washington, D.C. is Rina Shah, a political strategist and former Republican presidential campaign senior advisor. A very warm welcome to all of you. I'd like to start with a first quick answer from all of you on what you thought of Trump's inaugural address. Rina, I'll start with you in Washington, D.C.
I found it very jarring to see that kind of speech take place from the Capitol Rotunda, very much a campaign style speech. It wasn't fully surprising, but it was striking in so many ways. He clearly seems to have strength within his veins. Coming in as our oldest president, it's really one of those moments where you have to wonder what's next, because day one was just so action-packed, and that speech held so much in it, a lot to wrap our minds around. And so, again, my biggest takeaway was just how jarring that speech in the Capitol Rotunda was yesterday. And will he be able to carry out so much of what he promised?
James, as a career diplomat, what did you think of the optics of the president talking about how terrible the last administration was, as the former President Joe Biden just sat, an arm's length away from him, including a number of other presidents calling the Biden administration, radical and corrupt?
Well, Elizabeth, it's not the first time that we've heard Donald Trump give us rhetoric quite like that. I mean, the setting was a little different this time compared to 2016. But most of what he had to say, I think, did not surprise at least most of us here in Europe. We had expected a lot of it. And I think at the end of the day, we're not terribly surprised by what we heard. The optics, yes, very dramatic performance art, of course, there from Mr. Trump. But let's now see what he actually is able to do. And let's get a bit more detail about what his policy is going to be.
Nadia, what did you think, not just of the inaugural address, but the fact that Washington, this staunchly democratic city, was just taken over by the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement, in a way that we didn't see in the 2016 inauguration?
Right. Well, it's really clear that not only has Trump taken over the Republican Party, but he's also really ignited this populist move in the country. So Washington, D.C., as you saw in the Capitol building, really wasn't represented at Trump's inauguration. Neither were Democratic lawmakers. The city was largely silent. There weren't many people that were out and around that are lifelong Washingtonians or people from the DMV, Maryland, District of Columbia, and Virginia in attendance. But it was rather, like you mentioned, people coming in from outside of this region. So what I think this signals is that the city, and perhaps the policies that are put forth by the city in the most recent administration, might not reflect what the rest of the country wants.
All right. And if we move on into the executive orders, the actions that he's taken as expected, Rina, on day one, sweeping executive actions on immigration, that included things like ending the use of a border app that allowed migrants to enter the US legally. I wanted to ask you about taking executive actions such as those against things that are legal, and what kind of tone that sets. Does it not just invite more legal challenges?
To me, it's not about the tone. It's about the precedent being set here. The precedent that these kinds of actions are fully fine for any executive to take. What I think we're going to see, broadly speaking, with Trump is a real overreach of the executive's authority, a real broadening of the executive authority, because that is exactly what we saw yesterday in his most unusual style of signing these executive orders in an arena here in Washington, D.C. that was at capacity, with numerous family members of him behind him, his entire family, the vice president. And it was just it was a moment in which I was very much struck that this is a man that continues to think he alone can fix it. So that's not different than 2016. But what will be different this time is how the groups, immigration rights groups, civil rights groups, will be more ready to launch legal challenges against many of these promises made by Trump. Yesterday was a very hot and heavy day, is what I'll say. It was frigid cold in Washington, D.C. It was almost unbearable to be out and about for more than even 2-3 minutes. The temperatures were at really record lows. But in terms of the hotness, right? These issues have been front of mind for Americans for a long time. They've been fiery, and they've created debates amongst my fellow Americans from coast to coast. And I'm talking about, of course, the topic of mass deportations that Trump promised back for much of last year. At the convention last year, there were Republicans holding signs saying they are for mass deportations, an entire arena full of them. So it's all very fascinating to see how it plays out. What can hold weight is the real thing we should be asking ourselves. But again, I am most struck by the precedent it sets for a president to take these kind of actions, to make these moves. But again, these groups are ready.
And Nadia, do you think that the Trump administration is more ready this time to take on the legal challenges? When Rina talks about how the groups, the civil, the immigration rights groups are more ready. And in fact, he was sued on day one, I believe, by the American Civil Liberties Union for trying to end birthright citizenship. They say it's against federal law and the U.S. Constitution. But there are analysts who have said that this administration might have learned from the legal challenges the first time round and might have and has been working rather to word executive actions and orders differently.
Well, that is yet to be seen, right? It's day two. But on its face value, a lot of executive orders that he signed are either just symbolic, that they can actually go into effect because they will be challenged in court, or they're unconstitutional, and so they wouldn't pass muster in any court. But the other thing I think it's really important to note that the reason why people are thinking that Trump will be a little bit more advantaged in this election is that he put so many of jurists who were similar to his thought process or were sympathetic to his causes on the court, right? And so he put a lot of federal judges on, as well as lower court judges. And so we've seen, particularly in abortion access and rights, where cases were shopped around to find the most sympathetic judge that then escalated things up to the Supreme Court. And that Supreme Court that we know that he was able to put more jurors on that Supreme Court than his predecessor. And so which tilted the ideology of the court. And so whether these are constitutional or not, many of them most likely not pass muster. The part that is alarming to me is that he has stacked the deck. And so when he was the 45th president, there were things that the 46th president couldn't do to overturn, although Joe Biden did also add many members to the federal judiciary. But now when these cases are coming into the court now, some of what he did as 45 will be impacted what he does as 47.
Yeah, that's interesting. I also thought it was really interesting on day one, he removed senior leadership at the Justice Department agency overseeing immigration courts. James, I want to come back to you to another interesting point from the inauguration. I believe it was the first time that foreign leaders attended the inauguration. Interestingly, they were all far-right leaders, including Italy's Meloni and the Argentinian president, Javier Milei. What did you make of the makeup of the leaders and even politicians, you know, those from Germany's far-right AfD who attended this inauguration?
Yeah, again, not a surprise, because you've seen, if not Trump, then certainly his close associates, notably Elon Musk, making a lot of statements in the last couple of weeks, months on social media, supporting far-right parties in Europe, including the AfD in Germany, which is significant because the election in Germany is due next month, and that is playing in domestic politics in Germany. And of course, from the UK, some far-right politicians were there too, Nigel Farage and others. But familiar faces, you would have expected those people to be there. One person that wasn't there, interestingly enough, is Trump's best friend in Europe, probably, which is Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who for some reason or other didn't turn up, which was quite surprising. But overall, you would have expected those people to be there. But they don't represent big constituencies in Europe. It's important to add there. And down the road, there's going to be quite a lot of debate and difficulty and controversy on a number of issues vis-a-vis US-EU relations, above all trade. I mean, there was mention of tariffs on Canada and Mexico, but not in the wider world yesterday in the speech. We'll see whether that's a harbinger of things to come for Europe as well. And I think the other thing from the speech which I take away is there was a great deal of worry here about the withdrawal from the Climate Convention, which he was able to do with his executive order last night. And of course, the withdrawal from the WHO, which is a bizarre policy, it seems to me, probably reflecting the even more bizarre appointment of Mr. Robert F. Kennedy as his health secretary.
Yeah, we were expecting both of those withdrawals from those important multilateral agreements, weren't we? Both the Paris Climate Accord, which he did the last time he was president, but this time pulling out of the World Health Organization when America contributes about a fifth of the WHO's overall funding. I mean, James, what kind of impact is this going to have on the organization's operations around the world, including in so many areas like Gaza and Afghanistan, where it's dealing with emergencies?
Yeah, it's going to hurt, no doubt about that. I think there is a good chance that others will try to make up the gap in funding, not least here in Europe, but also in Japan and Korea and Australia and Canada and so on. But not having the US on board, not only for the point of view of the money, but also from the point of view of the expertise and the manpower, is going to be a big loss to the WHO. This organization, which plays such an important part in world affairs, not least its role in the last pandemic, and we've got more of that on the agenda to come, probably. This is very damaging and very worrying. Not entirely unexpected. He did it before. And of course, it will take time. He can't just withdraw from the WHO just like that. They have to go through a whole process, and the next year or two, it might change. But as I said, there are some very strange appointments in the Trump administration, above all that of Kennedy, which will probably support this going forward. A great pity.
Yeah, Rina, let me come to you with some of those appointments. You know, it's been noted that very few have political appointments, that they have been elected, you know, politicians that have been elected, apart from Senator Marco Rubio, who I believe has been confirmed as the Secretary of State. What does this makeup tell us about what to expect?
Well, look, first things first, I'm not at all surprised by much of what Trump is doing on the health front. If you listen to him in his time out of office, when he was kicked out of the White House in 2020, which I think was largely due to his mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic, what you heard from him and his people is that they wanted to get revenge on the people that they felt misled us about the origins of COVID-19. And what they really felt that the World Health Organization does is not important enough for us Americans within our borders, and that we continue to look outward instead of looking inward. And so from a policy perspective, I don't find it bizarre because I've been listening to Trump and I take him at his word. And a lot of Americans really wanted that. It's very important to note that the frustration from everyday Americans, whether they be in rural communities or urban communities, is the sense that our federal government is growing in size. It's too big, too bloated, and doing a lot with our money that we may not agree with. So this punitive action, though it be in such an important area such as our health, you know, when we talk about vaccinations and the public health, the public good, there's a lot there. You know, not being able to vaccinate people in other parts of the world can have a very negative impact on us within our borders. But the average American is sort of looking and saying, why do we nation build abroad so much? Why do we port over so much money instead of doing what we need to do here domestically? Look, I'm a mother, and I make no secret of that I'm raising 3 very small children. And it pains me to know that we, the richest country in the world, have children just down the road from me who are experiencing hunger. That's not right. My children go to school with those children. And if those children are not thriving, my child will not thrive despite my best efforts. And so what I see these appointments as doing is, look, we can think whatever we may want to think of Trump on a personal level, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on a personal level. But I see Trump's appointment of RK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as trying to turn things upside down, trying to get to kind of the root cause of the problem. We have loads of chemicals in our foods. We have regulations that are both good and bad. And so I'm not trying to convince the audience here to say, look at all these appointments as good. I'm trying to say, let's give them a chance on some level, because what Trump and the Republicans feel they have right now is a mandate to dismantle federal government as we know it.
And Nadia, that certainly, we didn't hear Trump talk about, children facing hunger, but he said that the healthcare system isn't working, that classrooms are teaching children to hate themselves. And certainly immigration culture wars have fueled Trump's rise in politics. I wonder what you thought of in his inaugural address when he was, talked about cutting government funding to diversity programs. And he got very loud applause when he said that US policy would only recognize that there are only two genders, male and female.
Yeah, again, like Rina, I wasn't surprised. Much of what was in the inauguration speech were things that Trump had been saying on the campaign trail. But it is really unfortunate, right? I am fortunate and blessed and to have the opportunity every day to be in a classroom, to share space and time with American students. And what I know is that the vast majority of American students do not see the world the way that Donald Trump does and have a generational difference, right, around the policy priorities and the way that they see themselves and the way that they see the United States. And gender is just one of them, right? Some of my students do not see themselves and others as fitting into these binary boxes of gender. They rather have this more fluid or this more open view of what gender looks like. So much so that legacy programs like mine that still have the title Women's in it. So I'm the director of Women's and Gender Studies at Georgetown. Many students really balk at having women in the title because they see women as an identity that is a social construct. Whereas second wave feminists and older Americans are really holding on to this identity of woman as a way to speak to specific challenges and opportunities that are faced by people who are female identified at birth. But so that is one of the things that I find surprising, probably challenging because the next generation doesn't see it this way. But also cutting funding to American universities is problematic. There is no way that America will become and sustain itself as a leader in education if the federal government does not support research development, as well as student development. And much of what Trump will oversee if he tries to either downsize the Department of Education, which happened under Reagan, or if he wants to cut it all together and kind of move the kind of financial oversight of the Department of Education over to the Treasury Department, is that what's going to hurt is not just the students themselves who are relying on government subsidies for their education, but also the federal government is the largest supplier of research funds that allows researchers like myself, to be able to learn more about real-world phenomenon. And what that does is it leads to things like healthcare innovations, it leads to things like policy innovations, as well as tech innovations, all the things that Trump says he wants to make America great again to do. But if there isn't the funding to back it up,
there's certainly a lot of emphasis in this administration on the tech sector, isn't there? James, coming back to you, whether it's culture wars or whether it's immigration, from where you're sitting in Brussels, and interestingly, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, he didn't attend the inauguration, but he did tweet on X. He announced an offensive to what he said occupy the European Parliament following Trump's return to the White House. He said only a few hours and even the sun will shine differently in Brussels. A new president in the US, a great patriotic faction in Brussels. The grand offensive can begin, Viktor Orban wrote. I mean, how hopeful are Europe's populists that Trump's return will help serve their interests back home, further normalize their nation first, their anti-immigrant rhetoric?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's very clear. For quite some time, in fact, all throughout the Trump campaign, the far-right parties have been hoping that he would prevail, and of course he has. And that is a shot in the arm for these parties. There's no doubt about that. But at the end of the day, what matters for Europeans, as it matters for the Americans as well, is who delivers, who actually will get Europe out of its rut at the moment in terms of economic growth and so on. We have a lot of challenges in that regard. And so far as that is concerned, Mr. Orban, frankly, is way out there on the edge of the cliff. He's nowhere near the mainstream. And indeed, although support for the far-right parties has grown in the last couple of years, we saw it in the last European Parliament elections, you still have centre-right and centre-left parties basically in control in most European countries and here in Brussels at the European Parliament. The question is, who's going to deliver, as I said. Mr. Orban has delivered absolutely nothing, it seems to me, neither for his people nor for Europe over the last 4 or 5 years, and that's pretty well known. But, okay, look, we'll see just how this Trump administration will deal with the European far right. I suspect that he won't have much time for European leaders in general. There will be a problem of neglect, I think, on that front, which, by the way, leads me to one last remark there. It was one of the things missing from his speech. Okay, he said he wanted to be a peacemaker. Good, let him be a peacemaker. The world desperately needs peacemakers right now. But there was no mention about Ukraine, which was probably a good thing. We could have expected worse on that front. And I suspect that within the Trump administration, there's quite a lot of debate going on internally. Maybe your guests know more about that than I do, as to how best to handle Ukraine going forward. But
yeah, no mention of Ukraine, and no confidence about Gaza when he spoke after the inauguration. Rina, we only have a couple of minutes left in the program, and I'd like to ask you the last question. You know, how does the Republican Party go forward the next 4 years? Those in the Republican Party who are not part of this MAGA movement, can they take the party back?
I wouldn't say there should be anyone holding out hope that the party can be taken back in a certain direction. I think anybody that feels like they connect with whatever President Trump is putting out there this time is probably a Republican, and needs to understand that this Republican Party still has divisions within it. And look, I think it's a healthy thing for there to be critics within a party. I think that's actually a perfectly fine thing to do, because especially we're at a time right now where most Americans don't want to affiliate with either of the major two parties. And more are affiliating as independent or just calling themselves centrist or politically homeless. But back to that question, how does the Republican Party move forward from here? Anybody that calls himself a Republican has to take this day by day. You know, President Trump has laid out the most ambitious agenda that I think I've heard of in modern presidential history. So, and I've studied it extensively. I just am very concerned about the norms and the establishments in our institutions. I have great faith in them, but the erosion of certain things that are sort of enshrined in our documents. And we do have a living document, the Constitution, but our founding fathers had a vision for this country. And I think more Republicans in general would be better off if they understood that President Trump is not the end-all, be-all. He may put out some good ideas. He may put out some terrible ideas, but he alone cannot fix it. So, roll up your sleeves and petition your government for what you don't like, as the founding fathers wanted. That's my advice to anyone.
And I guess the other question is also, can he alone break it? I'm afraid we'll run out of time. But I want to thank all of our guests for this discussion. That's Nadia Brown in Washington, D.C., James Moran in Brussels, and Rina Shah also in Washington, D.C. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.